Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Farhad Farnood. I'm a housing researcher specializing in the private rented sector with a good few years of experience working in University of Edinburgh's private residential side, dealing daily with private landlords. My contribution today considers the effects of the 2016 Private Tenancies Act and other Holyrood and Westminster changes around 5 years on, mainly with regards to the buy-to-let form of investment. It is timely to take stock of these effects as in 2021 the Scottish Government announced a rented sector strategy to be legislatively underpinned by a new housing bill to introduce in 2023. Consultation is currently underway. Let's briefly consider the raft of changes in recent years. As I said, now is a good time to reflect on where we stand, having had 4 years since the previous housing legislation came into force, and now that the multiple financial and tax changes have fed through. These include the land and buildings transaction tax, changes to the wear and tear allowance, and the introduction of the new mortgage interest tax relief credit, which restricts means landlords can now offset just 20% of their mortgage interest payments against tax. The legislation brought in the new Scottish private residential tenancy, a standard tenancy agreement which enshrined the provisions of the 2016 Act, including improved security of tenure. Needless to say, many landlords were unhappy at these changes. Changes perceived to undermine the profitability and even viability of being a private landlord naturally drew warnings from landlords themselves and their associations. In 2015, during the consultation for the Private Tenancies Act bill, as you would expect, there was considerable disquiet expressed from various parties associated with the private rented sector. CityLets published a survey suggesting up to 1/3 of private landlords could leave the sector or at least reduce their portfolios. 1/3. The Scottish Association of Landlords engaged closely with the consultation process constructively, but warned against demonizing private landlords and against heavy-handed rent control. A parliamentary petition was started claiming that the tax changes unfairly target private landlords by preventing us from offsetting costs in the same manner as other sole traders. It gained 60,000 signatures across the UK. Referring to the tax changes, the National Residential Landlords Association argued that the landlords would be battered by one of the most hostile tax regimes in the Western world. As the main announcements were coming through, I was conducting field work in Edinburgh. It was at this time, as I said, I was conducting the field work for my research and interviewing a cross-section of Edinburgh landlords. I found landlords of diverse motivations and backgrounds frustrated, but on balance still satisfied with its returns and its status as a long-term investment. I found many private landlords felt surrounded on all sides. Holyrood, Westminster, the media, who still seemed particularly keen to publish rogue landlord stories, and the feeling that general public would never shake off the century-old perception of private landlords as exploitative. The main question I was addressing back then was whether the private rented sector could be described as a mature market. In the light of all that has happened since then, this is not a question I would pose today, as there is simply too much instability to describe this market as mature. Too many moving parts, if you like. Let's move on to the measurable effects of the legislative and financial changes I have described. The provisions of the bill and the effects of the financial changes have undoubtedly started to be felt. By August 2018, the National Landlords Association reported that from April to June that year, 5 times more rental property was being sold than bought in Scotland. Meanwhile, between 2014 and 2018, the number of Scottish Airbnb listings rose from 2,000 to 10,000, with my own research suggesting that this was largely due to the reaction of small-scale landlords to the SPRT, the Scottish Private Residential Tenancy. Some effects were specific to student segment. The SPRT effectively excluded many private landlords from entering into term-time-only tenancies with students. Tenancies which allow them to profit from the peak season for short-term holiday lets. As a result, much of the student supply is switching to purpose-built student accommodation providers who are not covered by the SPRT and who have 43-week student tenancies, leaving 9 weeks available for short-term holiday lets. You only have to drive around Edinburgh to see these larger scale providers increasing their supply with new developments around the city. In 2021, there were reports of severe reductions in the supply of private rented accommodation, which was in particular causing difficulties for students. It is claimed that this is an unintended consequence of the Act 2016. As if these changes were not enough to be adjusted to, March 2020 saw a further unexpected disruption to the sector in the form of the pandemic. The private rented sector has a long history of politically driven goalpost shifting, but most recently it has fallen under the shadow of the most serious pandemic for decades. There is a good case for saying that the pandemic exposed the lack of security PRS tenants had when their income came under pressure, but also the vulnerability of the thousands of sometimes highly leveraged small-scale landlords reliant on prompt rent payments to meet their own mortgage obligations. In April 2020, restrictions on evictions were introduced as part of the Coronavirus Act, and these have been extended until March 2022. Notice periods were increased to 6 months for rent arrears, and throughout the pandemic, rent arrears owed to private landlords rose dramatically in what Andrew Watson and Nick Bailey correctly labeled as the pandemic arrears crisis. Newspaper reports talk about 15,000 Scottish landlords pursuing £126 million of arrears. We don't have definite data on the effect of the most recent pressures on the PRS, and it may take a while before we do. A reasonable assumption, though, is that the trend for private landlords to exit the sector will continue. Some of the pandemic restrictions will have actually delayed an exit as landlords wait for evictions to be implemented. Turning now to indication for future policy. This brings us up to date and back to the ongoing policy consultation. Early indications are that the main focus of the next bill will be on increasing tenants' rights and setting minimum standards regarding private rented dwellings. We learn of plans to increase penalties for illegal evictions and stronger enforcement, to restrict evictions during winter, give tenants greater flexibility to personalize their homes and keep pets, and to introduce a national housing standard that would apply to all homes. I sense that the direction of travel is to even out the differences between how social tenants and private tenants experience renting. In fact, the Scottish government states that it will offer a new deal for private rented sector tenants that puts them on a more equal footing with social rented tenants. This objective echoes the approach seen in some other European countries such as Sweden. And so, to a few concluding remarks. Scotland, like the UK as a whole, experienced a buy-to-let boom which drew tens of thousands of small-scale landlords into PRS, searching for returns not offered by shares or savings accounts. The global financial crisis and subsequent recession put an initial check on this boom. The subsequent dampers are more homegrown. Despite this, and despite the regulatory and financial changes I have spoken of, a Freedom of Information request responded to in October 2020 reported that there were 246,532 registered private landlords in Scotland, and a massive 94% of those had just one rented property. We know from earlier research that some of these will be so-called accidental landlords, and others may soon be seeking an exit delayed by the pandemic. This will still leave many small-scale landlords providing a significant proportion of the housing in Scotland, perhaps 12 to 14%. Greater stability is required for this part of the housing system, with both tenants and landlords too exposed to short-term changes in personal circumstances and economic shocks. Perhaps longer-term tenancies is one answer. In Germany, the average tenancy lasts 11 years, more than 4 times longer than in UK. After such a turbulent period, perhaps small-scale private landlords may now be ripe for such stability. As things stand, buy-to-let and small-scale landlordism is unlikely to be a source of significant investment in the future or a source of additional supply, particularly at the affordable end of the market. It is in this context we look to the next phase of policy. Well, that was a short overview of the buy-to-let part of the private rented sector in Scotland, the factors that have led us where we are now, and some thoughts about future directions. Thank you all for listening.